You have made us for yourself, and our heart is restless until it finds rest in thee. These are arguably the most famous words in St. Augustine's Confessions. We have heard these lines repeated in some form or translation, in some reference or allusion many times in our lives. We are also familiar with the apologetic explanations for Augustine's writing. To be made in the image of God is to be made in love for love. As Augustine later said, in his moment of despair, crying as his heart burned with illicit loves in the cauldron of iniquity that was Carthage, I was in love with love. Even though Augustine would later state that in his pursuit of love, his soul was in a putrid and rotting state, decaying from within as maggots and vermin gnawed away at him, his famous outburst that only God could satiate his restlessness, our restlessness, was the result of his incessant love to be loved. Later, in a haunting and famous section of the Confessions, Augustine reflects on why criminals break the law. Reflecting on his theft of pears with friends, in a moment of clarity and honesty, Augustine simply says the unadulterated truth of the matter. It was foul, and I loved it. Criminals break the law because they love to be criminals, to test the divine law, to exert domination over things, thereby stripping all free will and subjective value from whatever they are dominating. He desired shame for its own sake. Augustine wanted to be pursued by the justice of God because of the thrill of being a fugitive of love itself. He sought the exhilaration of the race to his own destruction, rather than the serene, contemplative peace of love with another. He enjoyed the exhilaration of sin. It is true that throughout the Confessions, the City of God, De Trinitate, and other writings, especially his homilies, that Augustine's scattered and decidedly unsystematic understanding of the image of God can be pieced together by scholars. In De Trinitate, on the Trinity, Augustine says that human rationality is our primary likeness unto God, for the soul is rational by its nature, as Augustine plainly describes it, the rational soul. Thus we have the capacity to know, so that we can know what love is. As he says, lover or knower is substance, knowledge is substance, and love is substance. Rationality and desire are, in Augustine's mind, ultimately united together once we properly understand both rationality and love. Love has a reason for existence, and reason, rationality, exists to primarily know the reality of love. This returns us to that most famous statement in the Confessions that now gets recontextualized in light of a systematized anthropology. Sprinkle in some City of God to reinforce the point, like when Augustine proclaims that peace is the desire of the soul in Book 19, and we can pretend that Augustine was a systematic thinker by tying so many disparate threads and musings together as a sort of unified whole. In short, Augustine's famous declaration is a summary of his understanding of human nature. We are creatures of love, made for love, whose desire for love finds fulfillment in love itself, namely God. Now, I do not think that the attempt to systematize Augustine's psychology and understanding of human nature is an unworthy endeavor. I myself have been engaged in doing precisely that, From my thesis at Yale to various writings on the Bishop of Hippo since graduation, published in journals, magazines, newspapers, and books. But I want to revisit the more immediate reality to Augustine's famous declaration, the reality that gets lost in the theologizing and the systemization of the Confessions, instead of listening to it as it was. The lamentation of a broken heart, a wounded soul, a man aggrieved and suffering, a runaway who fled his mother, a man who abandoned his concubine, the only woman he ever loved, never to see her again, a father who witnessed the death of his son, an exile who left his home country only to return to his homeland later and become a priest and bishop among the community of people he initially despised and was indoctrinated to hate as a Manichaean. It is well known that Augustine actually wept at his ordination. He wept not because he was filled with joy, but because he didn't want to live a life in service to God. He did not desire that contemplative peace offered in a life of prayer and service to the poor and the faithful of God, though that is what ultimately changed him for the better, as he comes to realize as he writes the Confessions later in his life. Love is the great theme in Augustine's writings. Love saturates the entirety of the Confessions. The battle between love and lust, which is an internal war over the nature of love itself, is the governing principle of the city of God. Among all the patristic fathers, Augustine is the most daring in his interpretation of the first epistle of John, where the Johannine author declares, God is love, Deus delectio est in the Latin translation. Augustine immediately inverts the sentence so that it also means love is God, delectio Deus est, he writes in one of his homilies, implying that love itself is the divine nature manifesting itself in our world and in our life. Yet love often seems to be fugitive, running away from us, slipping through our fingertips, dissipating with time. The love that moves our being never seems permanent. It never seems to confer unto us the peace and happiness that we seek. The young Augustine, the Augustine who was stealing pears, having sex with a woman after finishing teaching rhetoric to students at school, and who sought to remove himself from the overweening presence of his drunken mother, is hardly the material for a rock star saint, let alone one of the 4 doctors of the church. He is, frankly, a bad role model, and Augustine knows this. The young Augustine is clearly an embarrassment to the now older and maturing Augustine, the Augustine who writes the Confessions and becomes the thinker that made him the most important theologian in the history of Western Christianity. We have the classicist and essayist Gary Wills to thank for giving a name to Augustine's concubine, the only one Augustine ever loved and was faithful to, Una, the one, because she was the only one he ever loved. Augustine and Una never married, but in the 4th and the 5th century, their status was regarded as a sort of common law marriage, and it did not bar either of them from entering the church. Even though Una accompanied Augustine and their son to Rome, Saint Monica's scheming to push her out of the picture and to continue to advance Augustine's social and political prospects sent Una packing. Another woman was selected for Augustine to marry, but then Augustine converted. He never married. There is evidence that Una was a Christian and joined a monastery, possibly becoming a saint like her lover. Nevertheless, it is clear, by carefully reading the Confessions, the ghost of Una looms over the entire text. She is everywhere, even though never named or even physically described or given a single spoken line. However, we know she was the one. She was the only woman for me, and I was faithful to her, as Augustine proclaims. Even so far removed from their last bedroom dalliance together, Augustine still can't forget her. He can't stop thinking about her, even as he tries to suppress their memory together by leaving her nameless throughout the Confessions. Augustine was evidently struck by Cupid's arrow, and the wound from that arrow of love never healed. We should, though, be thankful that it never healed, for out of that wound grew the mature Augustine's theology of love and memory that preoccupied much of his best writing and thinking, and what the Confessions ultimately deals with during the second half of the work. The question of needing healed for various loves that were improper also looms over the Confessions. He acknowledges he loved the rhetoric of Cicero over the vulgar and sometimes clumsy language of the Bible. Augustine also states he wept over Dido's love for Aeneas and her suicide instead of tending to the ruination of his own soul when he was a schoolboy. He loved winning the praise and adoration of others, so, he confesses, he cheated to ensure he would receive that praise and adoration from his schoolmates to his teachers. As Augustine said about his theft of the pears, he loved the foulness of law-breaking for the simple sake of foulness. He loved being a fugitive of the one love that makes all love possible and good. In a word, Augustine loved himself, his own idea of love, and his own will for love. The bubbling and burning cauldron he bathed in was pleasant, at least for a time being. When Augustine turns away from these supposed illicit loves, it is not because God is the only subject to be loved. As he says in De Trinitate, this word is conceived in love of either the creature or the Creator, that is, of the changeable nature or unchangeable truth, which means either in covetousness or in charity. Not that the creature is not to be loved, but if that love is related to the Creator, it will no longer be covetousness but charity. The lower creature should be used to bring us to God. The creature, on a par, should be enjoyed but in God. As Augustine clearly states in this very important passage of De Trinitate, when you love without knowledge of God, when you love the things of this world by shunning God, you are engaged in covetousness. You are engaged in a love that is ultimately self-centered. You actually don't care about the other person that you love. You don't care about the world that you find beautiful. Your only concern is yourself. This, of course, has echoes of the restless heart trying to find rest in God. It is through the love of God that the love of a creature, the love of creation, is made whole and properly enjoyable. Thus, the mature Augustine realizes that it is good to love others. It is good to love the creature and the creation, so long as we also understand that God is present in the creature and in the creation. That is what the mature Augustine recognizes. That is what the mature Augustine realizes looking back on the shortcomings of his youthful self. What the young Augustine missed was not recognizing God in the loves that so moved his being, his soul, and his very body. My weight is my love, Wherever I am carried, my love is carrying me. Now, the mature Augustine realizes that the weight of that love carrying him all along was God, who is love itself. And so when Augustine says, in the city of God, that we are nothing but wills of love, Augustine also recognizes that such a statement means that our love is the very will of God, for God is love, and we are manifestations of love itself, for we are images of love. The older Augustine can now recognize what that weight of love was and what the will of love moving humans is. It is always God, whether we realize it or not. The difference, though, is that we need to come to realize that the love moving us is divinity itself. Once we realize the fugitive love we pursue is an image of divine love because it was created by love itself, we are capable of turning our runaway heart away from just ourselves, that covetousness that Augustine speaks of, and toward others, recognizing the inherent worth in their love and beauty because God is there. Thus, covetousness becomes charity. This is Augustine's haunting revelation in Book 10 of the Confessions. Too late did I love you, for behold, you were within me. Since God is love and love is God, all love, properly speaking, is divine. And once we realize this, we can bring sanctification and beautification to all the good things that God has made: the pair, other people, ourselves. Too late have I loved you, beauty ever ancient, beauty ever new. The love within us is divinity itself. This, in a way, permitted Augustine to calm himself over the state of Una's soul and his own. Implicitly, as is becoming clear in a careful reading of the Confessions, he still cares for Una because that is the demand of charity. He realizes that he was the cause of her misdirected love, her sin, for that is what sin is in Augustine's imaginative theology: a misdirected and ignorant love, a love directed only to the self without knowledge of the God who created the love that is bestowed unto us. He hasn't seen her since he sent her away. He will never see her again. By writing about her, even without naming her, he did so to protect her identity, we might add. He recognizes that he is also suggesting and even saying that she did nothing wrong. Augustine did everything wrong, and Una suffered because of him. Now, in being able to see God in her, and being able to see God in their love they shared together, Augustine is able to cease his running away and rest at peace that the love he shared with Una can be forgiven and sanctified. How so? Because he was seeking God all along. He just didn't know it. And so was she. It was his own stupidity, his own ignorance, his own self-conceited heart that prevented that reality from being known when they were together. But now he recognizes it as they are separated, and he grew older and wiser as a pastor, tending to the care of hundreds of parishioners on a daily basis. Augustine hopes that Una recognizes the same wherever she may be, that the love that she pursued with Augustine was in fact divine love itself. Let us not downplay the remarkable statement that Augustine confesses to God and the world that she was, quote, the only woman for me, and I was faithful to her." End quote. It is safe to assume that Una was literate. Augustine, her de facto husband, was a teacher of rhetoric and language. Their son was a child prodigy by Augustine's own depiction of him in the Confessions and in other writings. So if Una could read, which is almost certainly the case, as she would have also been the one educating the young Adeodatus while Augustine was busy teaching schoolchildren, then Una could have picked up the Confessions and read the proclamation of the man who loved her, that she still held captive his heart even after his ordination and ascension to the episcopal office of Hippo. The restless heart that Augustine speaks of in the Confessions is definitely his. It is uniquely his. The stories of the heart he tells in the Confessions are solely his and no one else's. The runaway heart is his. The anxiety, the grief, the brokenness of Augustine is his own. Augustine doesn't want to be lonely, even though he is extremely lonely. But Augustine also knows that all his loves are also the loves that others share. Others love Cicero. Others love Virgil. Others love thievery. Others love women whom they do not marry. Others love the burning desire that consumes them every second of their existence, day and night, week by week, year after year. Augustine, at first glance, seems to suggest that all his various loves were the problem. But when we read him carefully, he does not conclude that at all. Bad readers and bad interpreters of Augustine conclude what Augustine nowhere ever states. Augustine plainly states, by contrast, that he didn't know God and therefore couldn't know the true beauty and goodness that existed all around him, the beauty of the pear he stole and the goodness of the woman with whom he bore a child. The problem wasn't what Augustine loved. The problem was Augustine didn't know love and therefore didn't love enough. He didn't love all the beautiful and good things of the world in relationship with the beauty and goodness of the love that makes all things good and beautiful. By not loving God, he couldn't love all the good and beautiful things that God had created for the blissful happiness offered to humanity through the good and beautiful things of this world. That happiness, Augustine finally realizes, is found in our knowledge. It is found in knowing. Knowledge and happiness go together. As he says toward the end of the Confessions, "For the happy life is not seen by the eyes because it is no physical entity. It is surely not the way in which we remember numbers. A person who has a grasp of numbers does not still seek to acquire this knowledge because he already has it. But the happy life we already have in our knowledge, and so we love it." Again, what Augustine declares here in Book 10 of the Confessions is that through knowledge and memory of love, we achieve happiness. Happiness is a product of knowing another. It is a product of knowing the beauty and the goodness of the world, of knowing the beauty and goodness of ourselves, of knowing the beauty and goodness of God. When Augustine breaks down, he remarks that he had thought God was far from him. Now he knows how wrong-headed he was. God was always with him, within him, as he comes to realize. And while so many good and beautiful things had been taken away from him, or more properly, he pushed those good and beautiful things away because of his own stupidity, he can now foster a renewed love with those good and beautiful things through the oasis of his memory, because he finally has the knowledge of true love. He doesn't need the limited physical thing in his grasp to recover the love that was there all along, the love that was hidden to him in his lack of knowledge. Memory is the great philosophical achievement in Augustine's theology. Memory is a major theme in the latter half of the Confessions, and frankly, memory is the entire focus of the Confessions itself. For Augustine wouldn't be able to tell us anything if he didn't remember what he was talking about. Memory is also a major theme throughout De Trinitate. Memory is even a great theme in the City of God. Although Augustine routinely focuses on his shortcomings in the Confessions, it is through this new memorial knowledge that Augustine implicitly sanctifies these shortcomings by recognizing the love that governs the entirety of the cosmos. This is what his younger self couldn't realize. Even as we lose so much, and Augustine lost so much, the knowledge of love that he finally achieved allowed him to recover those losses in a richer and more meaningful way than if he merely clasped onto those things unto his dying breath, and they decayed with him. On the contrary, he focuses on his shortcomings precisely because, now that he has knowledge of love, now that he knows God was always with him, he can look back upon those sinful moments and recover the actual goodness and beauty that was there. The love he had for his friends, the love he had for Una, the love of the beauty of language, so on and so forth, all of which can, in fact, direct us to divine reality. Although Una is gone forever from Augustine's physical side, she exists forever in his memory. As a famous movie would say, we'll always have Paris. And Augustine will always have Una, because Augustine found God, and he can finally rest without fear that he ruined the souls of others, especially hers. By coming to have knowledge of God, he can now look back upon every moment he shared with her and realize that true love was in fact there, and that cannot be taken away from him. The Confessions is a warning against ignorance, the ignorance of God and the ignorance of the love that creates and sustains all things. And this is the real danger and deficiency of Manichaeanism. It is also a work of encouragement. The encouragement that even if you are broken, lonely, and afraid, running away from the love that you so desperately seek, the Christus Medicus, Christ the healer, is always by your side, waiting to apply the remedy for your runaway soul. Love, a love that is not fugitive and fleeting, but steady and eternal. A love that can sanctify all things once you come to realize the knowledge of what that love means. Now Augustine recognizes he was right to love Dido's love, for she did not really just seek Aeneas, but wanted to love God with and through Aeneas, because, as he says, love is divine. He was right to love the beauty and eloquence of Cicero, whose lovely speech directed Augustine to the pursuit of friendship and philosophical truth, which finds ultimate fulfillment in God. The beauty and truth of Cicero's rhetoric is not of man, but of a divine nature. And he was just in his love for Una, who was made in the image of God, and also desired to love and be loved, just as God wills for all of us. Augustine's runaway heart is no longer running. The love he was pursuing is no longer fugitive to the fading effervescence of time. The love he had and still has is healed and made eternal in his memory as his mind is sanctified by the knowledge of divine love itself. The love that is divine has the power to heal and sanctify all things. Luckily for Augustine, he had enough time to realize this. And luckily for us, we have time to realize that powerful reality too. When we read the Confessions of Augustine, we begin to realize that he is not providing a systematic account of human nature or theology. In reality, he is being moved by the memory of his love for Una, his love for Cicero, his love of the world that he once thought was wrong and now realizes was never wrong. Because once we come to know the reality of God, the love that was always moving us was divine love to begin with. And as a result of that, as is so now clearly visible throughout the Confessions, that love was always beautiful and always good. Augustine is trying to warn all of his readers down through the ages that if you know that God is love and love is God, the love you have will not produce envy, jealousy, anger, grief, or suffering as what happened to him, but bring fulfillment and happiness to your life. Augustine may only now be able to enjoy that happiness in his memory, but it is a happiness that he can now rest with.